we might get a couple other people floating in, but does anybody have any updates they want to share or issues they're working on before we get started?
I would happily accept questions if there are any before we get going with the questions, with the text, whatever it turns out to be.
Great. Welcome, Ann and Kim and Brian, Bruce, John.
Hi there.
Good morning.
Before we get into the presentation, just offering if anybody has any questions or issues that they would like to share. I have one, and that is had some discussions with the communications department about making this a podcast, which
Okay.
I'm not sure would make this any different than it already is. But if you have any thoughts about that one way or the other, maybe
That's
how to
fine
make
with
it.
me. It might get some additional people interested in stuff.
It'd
Yeah.
be easy to do. You just record this and then record the audio. There would be some editing involved. You know, we have, like, for instance, in the last couple minutes, we've had a lot of silence as we stared at our screens. That should be edited out. That's not good audio. But it seems like a really good idea. I would suggest you'd want to concentrate more on presentations, because some of the general conversation is actually very stimulating, fun to listen to. And then sometimes we're grasping for things to talk about, you know. But my general thoughts as a semi-avid podcast listener myself.
Thank you, Brian. That's very helpful. Yeah, I'm not a regular. So if you have other thoughts about that, Kim shared one in the chat. It'd be nice to be able to hear recordings of days we can't attend. Does anybody else have any other thoughts about that before we get right into Peter's presentation?
I think it's a good idea because I think, you know, some people listen to podcasts. Like, I know I have a friend who listens to a lot of podcasts. He primarily does it when he walks. And so, you know, it's an opportunity to kind of reach some folks who might not want to watch you know, a recording. It's just, you know, as long as it's not too much work, I think Brian's right. It wouldn't be much extra work.
Great. Well, thank you for your feedback. And if you have more, feel free to email me or call me. Well, welcome, Peter, again.
Thank you.
We
I'm going to hit the share screen button just to see if I'm still active in this way.
Great. Peter, as most of you know, is going to talk a little bit about poisonous plants and their friends. And he has been a curator for the Beal Garden for several years, as well as a longtime instructor on wilderness survival, and just as a wealth of knowledge. Thanks for joining us, Peter, and I'll let you take it from here.
It's a pleasure. Okay, the first plant I'm going to highlight today is pawpaw. Pawpaws are in the Ananaceae, which is almost entirely tropical in its distribution. The only plant in this family that we have at this latitude is our native pawpaw, Asimina triloba. These are what the flowers look like. And you'll notice the color is this deep red maroon. And in the ecology of pollinators, deep red maroon is actually attractive to things that are attracted to raw meat. And actually, pawpaws, flowers, actually are designed to attract sarcophagid type flies, the kind of things that would be attracted to roadkill, for instance. And in fact, if you sniff one of these flowers, you get essence of roadkill, which is one of the couple of reasons it never caught on in the corsage industry. So for that reason, many people who grow pawpaws for their fruit actually patrol the roads in early May for roadkill that they hang up in the tree so that to increase the pollination rate and therefore increase fruit set in their pawpaws. Pawpaws are usually fairly small trees. This one here in front of us on the left is actually about 6 inches in diameter, but we have them at the Beale Garden since the 1880s or 90s, and some of them are over 10 inches in diameter. Here's what they look like. They're pretty interesting looking. The fruits, which we call pawpaws, now, of course, if you come from the tropics, you know there are other fruits that are also called pawpaws, namely, it eludes me at this moment. Little brain fart, nothing serious. No recent lightning strikes that I know of. Anyway, here we are. Pawpaw fruits, when they're ripe, are sort of soft and very sweet, and are sometimes listed under the name custard apple because of their properties as a fruit. Here's a cross section of one of those flowers. Pawpaws produce a toxin series known as annonaceous acetogenins, and they are in every part of the tree, including the ripe fruit. Although we bipeds, by and large, our physiology does not see annonaceous acetogenins, so except for a few people who are under the impression that they are allergic, and they may be, by and large, we don't really see very much in the literature about humans being poisoned by annonaceous acetogenins, especially pawpaws. Here's what the fruit looks like. They are avidly sought after by our companion rodents in the environment, and so you sort of have to be there on the spot, ready to go. Otherwise, the beautiful, sweet smell of these things will attract other creatures who enjoy them as much as you do. The toxin is also in the fruit, as I say, but the toxin is also in the leaves and the seeds. This butterfly, very beautiful butterfly called the zebra swallowtail, its larvae feed exclusively on pawpaws, and therefore are quite rare in this part of the world. When I was a kid, I was a fanatic insect collector and would have happily traded any of my classmates for one of these. Although there was a little area in southwest corner of Michigan down around the town of Buchanan, which I referred to as a pawpaw savanna. It's basically a grassland with clumps of pawpaws growing in it. And for 3 weeks a year, that environment had so many of these zebra swallowtails in it that they were more common than the white cabbage butterflies. Pretty unusual. Anyway, annonaceous acetogenins are eaten to no effect on the caterpillars, and the caterpillars actually sequester these toxins in the same manner that we are familiar with monarch butterflies sequestering the cardiac glycosides in milkweed to make themselves toxic. And so emerged zebra swallowtails are toxic to birds in the same way that monarchs are, except the toxin is different. For a while, people consumed tea from pawpaw leaves. And like as I say in note number 3 there, they have been implicated in a kind of atypical Parkinsonism. Although there are no big literature explanations about this. And the very large shiny seeds inside of pawpaws, which are only a problem in the sense that they're so shiny and smooth that you can inadvertently swallow them. And I don't recommend that, since people have done boiled water extracts of those seeds and used that as a way to control black flea beetles on bush beans. And I figure any toxin tough enough to take down a beetle is probably powerful enough to cause trouble for us bipeds in certain doses. When I talk about milkweeds, when I was first learning plant systematics, the milkweeds had their own family. Milkweed are almost always in the genus Asclepias and given their own family, the Asclepiadaceae. However, the APG, the Angiosperm phylogeny group, has found that genetically, the milkweeds are all sort of nested within members of the dogbane family, the Apocynaceae. The Apocynaceae is now the family of dogbanes and milkweeds, and the Apocynaceae specialize in a group of toxins generally referred to as cardiac glycosides. And as such, that word cardiac is not in there for nothing. So they have many of the cardiac glycosides were used as heart medicine in herbal medicine. I do not advocate self-medication for heart issues. We have perfectly good cardiologists in this part of the world who can give you much less dangerous things to modify your heart performance than eating anything in the dogbane group. There are 2 forms of cardiac glycosides. We have the regular cardiac glycosides in common milkweed, which we call cardenolides. And then we have the other half of the cardiac glycoside group are called bufadinolides. And that word bufa is originally from the Latin word bufo, which is the Latin word for toad, because bufadinolides were originally found in toad skins before they were ever identified in plants. And they are not vitamins. They are highly toxic and often neurotoxic in their effects, and therefore I do not recommend taking them. Mostly, our broad-leafed milkweeds, such as common milkweed, are limited to the production of cardenolides. But the narrow-leafed milkweeds, which apparently also includes swamp milkweed, which is the picture on your screen, also include some amount of bufadinolides. Milkweeds with very thin leaves in whorls, such as whorled or white milkweed, contain quite a high yield of bufadinolides, and therefore I do not recommend them as food for any mammal. So if you have goats and you see them starting to nibble around things like butterfly weed or white flowered milkweed, I would do everything I could to get them off of any interest in that plant. And like I say, swamp milkweed has been implicated in the occurrence of a low level of bufadinolides as well. Here's a little bit closer up on the swamp milkweed flowers. They're very pretty. They have a thick, almost vanilla scent to them. They are used as food by the monarch butterfly, but their flowers are very attractive to a wide range of butterflies. And one of the nice things about having this in your garden is the number of butterflies that it brings for you to see at close range. It gets about 3 feet tall or slightly taller. They're not terribly rare, but you don't see a lot of people growing them in their gardens. Excuse me. Here they are in gone to seed. Their seed structure with their silky pappuses for wind distribution are quite typical of the milkweed group, as most of you probably know already. This is butterfly weed. Now, butterfly weed is an excellent name for this plant, since if you grow one of these and you don't get any butterflies on it all season, that's a good indication you have no butterflies in your area, because they are so richly attractive to virtually every family of butterflies, including the skipper group. Here they are releasing seeds, and certainly a typical milkweed habit by all standards. This is the really toxic local milkweed that we have, whorled milkweed or white milkweed for the flowers. This actually is quite common around here, and the place where it's most common is in the median of the expressways. I used to see this plant in the median and wonder what it was. So one day I said to my wife, we got to stop. I got to get out and look at that plant. And she says, you are not stopping so you can walk across the expressway. Eventually she relented and I got some pictures. At this point, I usually tell people that's one tiny vignette of what it's like to be married to me, always hopping out of the car in less than ideal conditions. This stuff was about 1.5 to 2 feet tall. And like I say, this is one of the more poisonous milkweeds because of the bufadinolides involved. Most milkweeds don't taste terribly great to most herbivores, so milkweed toxicity is not usually one of the frontline issues for herbivore raisers. And here we have a monarch, or the monarch butterfly. The specimen featured on the left, of course, is a male, and you can tell that it is a male because right in here you can see these two thickenings of the one of the anal veins on the wing of the butterfly. This is actually a scent producing gland which is used to attract females. Monarch butterflies, of course, sequester the toxic cardiac glycosides of the milkweed plant after their larvae and for the rest of their lives. And I always read as a kid that this was because it makes the monarch butterfly taste bad. Actually, those cardiac glycosides in the body of a monarch butterfly are still extremely toxic to any bird that would dare to eat this. And in fact, many young blue jays who find these in the spring and eat one to see are killed by their very first experience eating a monarch butterfly. And yes, the coloration of orange and black is designed to stick in the mind of any predator who, of course, might remember back to the day he ate this orange and black thing and had a really bad morning. This kind of coloration as warning for toxicity is called aposematic coloration. And the monarch butterfly is certainly the poster child for aposematic warning colors. This is a picture of a common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, which, even though it means the milkweed from Syria, like I point out here, just because the name is taxonomically correct doesn't necessarily mean it makes any sense. The standards of botanical nomenclature do not include that you have to make sense. Here is a close-up of the flower. You notice up in this region right here, in the left flower facing us, is a long vertical slit. This slit, which above it has this little black mark here, that little black thing is actually a hook. And it's connected to the pollen bags, the pollinaria inside the flower. So when an insect gets its tarsal hooks caught on that little hook, the act of pulling their foot back pulls out the pollinaria. And then to be pollinated, it has to insert the pollinaria into this vertical slit. Kind of a low probability chance, you say. Well, absolutely true. And it explains why when you look at the umbel that a milkweed flower structure represents, how often do you see more than one or two being transformed into pods? It's a low success rate type of pollination. But the killer is you have to be a big creature to pull out those pollinaria. And if you look at this flower here, I hope you can see my cursor. I am rolling the cursor and this diagram around this structure right here. This is an insect leg. This is the leg of an insect who got caught in the pollinaria hook and was not strong enough to pull out the pollinaria bags themselves. So at that point, as an insect, your choice is hang around till you die of thirst and starvation, or release that leg and be able to fly away. And many of the butterflies in the nymphalid family, the brush-footed family, have the ability to sacrifice a leg in order to survive. When you look at milkweed flowers close up, many times you'll see dead flies stuck to the flower. And that has to do with the fact that flies generally do not have the option of releasing a leg in order to save themselves. It's quite a big family once you get outside of the milkweeds. Here's one of our common genera here. This is the genus Apocynon, after which the family is actually named, and they are the dogbanes. And the dogbanes are generally a source of utility fiber. I have made twine and fishnet out of the fibers, the bast fibers of dogbane. In the Native American cultures, they were also used for this. Of course, Native American cultures didn't overlook the use of just about anything. And so this was a very popular source of cord, twine, for fishing and for trapping. This beauty right here is actually a leaf beetle, the dogbane leaf beetle in the chrysomelid family. And this is a beetle protected by sequestering the cardiac glycosides of the dogbane. I haven't read about bufadinolides with this species, but it's entirely feasible. And as you see, they are quite beautiful. Now, this family, the borage family, the Boraginaceae, are the headquarters, if you will, for a group of toxins called pyrrolizidine alkaloids. Borage used to be used, excuse me, as a salad plant, and it has also been used as a medicinal plant, and so has comfrey. Comfrey is a powerful and at one time popular anti-inflammatory. However, both of these plants are relatively loaded with pyrrolizidine alkaloids. The pyrrolizidine alkaloids are either liver toxins or liver carcinogens or both. Many of the animals in the front line of this family are able to convert the outright toxic pyrrolizidine alkaloids into carcinogenic secondary metabolites. And eating something that's carcinogenic isn't a world of improvement over just being toxic. So I counsel people not to use the members of this family internally. If you want the anti-inflammatory use of comfrey, feel free to produce a salve to be used topically or externally, but I would not recommend throwing these leaves in a salad, especially for the younger people are more susceptible to the toxin than adults. In fact, in the literature, you find examples of babies who were poisoned in the womb because their mother ate or took remedies in the borage family. So, like I say, borage is sort of headquarters for these products. They are also found in some of the pea family and in a whole subfamily of the daisy family. The genus Senecio are headquarters for their own subgroup of this toxin group. This is basically just a rehash of what I just said. This is what actual borage itself looks like. Borage used to be used in pickles, in salad products, and several other edible uses that I do not advocate anymore. This is comfrey. Like I said, it's an effective anti-inflammatory, but don't take it internally unless you have a titanium liver. Comfrey was kind of a desirable plant in some ways. We have comfrey in our backyard, and we found that after being given a healthy set of cuttings of this plant, that this plant is, to say this plant is invasive is an understatement. I think it can be controlled with tactical nuclear weapons, but anything short of that is going to be challenging. So transplant this into your yard, knowing that it's going to be a source of work for you because it would have to be controlled. It can take over and shade out many other plants, some of which you may actually want. These are the flowers of comfrey. They are produced in these terminal clusters. In varying shades of blue and purple. Now these spring beautiful flowers are called Virginia bluebells. They're in the genus Mertensia. In some places they were actually called Jefferson's bluebells because Jefferson at his property in Virginia had a multitude of these and advocated for keeping them in several horticultural magazines of the day. They are beautiful blue flowers, and people have used these plants as salad greens from time to time. And again, I caution, pyrrolizidine alkaloids are the price of taking these internally, so I do not advocate that particular menu item. This shows an interesting characteristic of many borage family plants. The flower buds in this area you see are pink, and gradually they transform into blue. This is because of a reaction of the pigments to the pH of the sap of the plant. It gets more acidic as life goes on and becomes less pink and more blue. These are basically spring ephemerals. And again, they will spread a bit once you get them, but in my case, I don't mind having more of these beautiful flowers around. Here's what they look like sort of head on. Now, what I'm about to show you come mostly from this paper. And this is the only scientific paper I have ever seen in my life that uses the word nuptial garment in the title. And it goes like this. This amazing moth, this is the scarlet-bodied wasp moth, and it feeds on this vine. This vine, Macania scandens, is actually a plant of the southeast and is the sole larval food plant for the scarlet wasp moth. However, we do have one patch of this, at least, in the state of Michigan, near the expressway. As you approach the town of Muskegon from the south, there are patches of this in the woods. Notice the white flowers. Done noticing? This is another plant in the aster family. This is Eupatorium capillifolium, called dog fennel. We don't see this plant in Michigan, but if you go to somewhere down south, like Alabama, as you look out the window as you drive down the expressway, you'll see acres and acres of this plant. It is a toxic plant because of pyrrolizidine alkaloids. When the male moth emerges, it seeks out dog fennel, which is not a food plant for this creature. Now, this is a much more famous plant in the same group. This is called white snake root. Eupatorium rugosum was its old name. Its new name is Ageratina altissima. And this plant is toxic by virtue of trematol type alkaloids. Trematol causes a well-known disorder from colonial times called milk fever. If your herbivore eats this plant, the females are largely protected because of the action of their endocrine system from accumulating the neurotoxic trematol in this plant. Unfortunately, the female also gets rid of this toxin in the milk. And so the milk of a herbivore female that has eaten this plant is toxic and causes milk fever. Milk fever, of course, killed Abraham Lincoln's mother when he was 8, excuse me, and caused Mr. Lincoln, Abe's father, to move the family from Indiana west to Illinois. Thinking that this was a disease to be caught like bacteria, he figured if you moved out closer to the frontier, you might have a chance of being in a place where the disease has not caught up with you yet. It wasn't until the early 1900s or late 1800s when a Native American woman taught the settlers around where she lived that this plant was the problem for their milk fever. Now, she taught this to a woman who found her in the woods one day. And of course, in that era, the word of knowledgeable women was not taken terribly seriously by the male-dominated medical opinion of the day. And so milk fever fatalities went on for some time. But this plant is fairly common. gets to be about 4 feet tall. You can see the sort of raggedy white flowers. Mostly lives in the woods or along stream edges that are wooded. This petite little spider is in the genus Nephyla. Probably the largest web spinning spiders in the world are in this genus. I tried to download an internet picture, which I was unsuccessful, of an Australian species that gets, the body of the spider is much larger than a person's hand. This particular spider, as you can see by the barbed wire for scale, is about as big as my hand also. So for people who are scared of spiders, this is one of the worst case scenarios. This is called a golden web spider. And if you've ever taken trails in South Alabama or Florida, when the sun hits these webs that are enormous, it looks like spun metallic gold. And that's what gives it its name. The webs themselves may be up to about 7 feet in diameter. And when you run into one on the trail, even if the spider is not in the middle of it, you know that you ran into something. It's quite strong and actually succeeds in catching birds and lizards from time to time. When I was doing wildlife films in East Africa, we stayed at Nature Conservation Films headquarters, a Dutch wildlife film outfit in Arusha, Tanzania. And we had 2 trees at each side of the yard, separated by about 50 feet of airspace. And Nephyla spiders made webs that extended the whole distance between these 50-foot apart trees. And like I say, Australia and Madagascar both have Nephyla spider species that are larger than this one. The male moth, as soon as they emerge, they start looking for those dog fennel plants. When they find one that is wounded, they feed on the exuded sap, which is very high in pyrrolizidine alkaloids. Now, this moth has an anatomical feature. Now, my blue line here is pointing to that feature. It's a sac underneath the thorax that holds scales, very easily carried in the wind, dust-like scales, which the paper calls flocculent. And when the male mates with the female, he sprays these toxic flocculent scales all over the female. The other place that the pyrrolizidine alkaloids ended up is in the sperm packet. So mating provides a big dose of these toxins to the female. And here you see the male moth, and on the right, you see the sacs of flocculant being sprayed out in the air by his legs. By covering the female with these scales, here are the scales, notice how they are adapted for maximum surface area. So there's lots of places for these little thread-like scales to get stuck. And the alkaloid that's in them is immediately in contact with the air because of the way these scales are built. So the female leaves the mating experience with a decoration of this toxic white flocculent thread-like fluff-like scales. The amazing thing is, a female who's been covered with these scales gets in the web of these giant Nephyla spiders. The Nephyla spider rushes over there and apparently can smell the toxin in these scales and has the amazing effect on the spider of making her cut her own web and release the moth. Now, I've never heard of anything remotely like this in the arthropod world. In fact, I've never heard of an adaptation in any species of anything, much less Lepidoptera, causing a spider to reject a prey animal that ended up in the web in this way. Now, in a totally other toxic vein, we have this beautiful wildflower called white turtlehead. Its other name is Chelone glabra. And these flowers have evolved with bumblebees. And the opening of this flower is exactly the dimension of the common bumblebee called Bombus impatiens. And it's got little footholds and everything. So the bumblebee is clearly an intended customer for this flower. However, the flower has toxic nectar. Bumblebees very often carry this parasite that is mentioned up here in the top row, Crithridia bombi, which is a trypanosome. Now, trypanosomes, of course, include the parasite that gives human beings sleeping sickness and Chagas disease. And in bumblebees, once their populations get high, they can actually kill the bumblebee or reduce their reproductive ability. Here's what they look like. They have a long single flagella, just like the human trypanosomes. When bumblebees drink this nectar, the toxins, which include anabasine and an iridoid glycoside called aucubin, kill a significant number of these parasites inside the bumblebee, restoring them to health and reproductive potential. This adds bumblebees to the growing list of creatures who self-medicate, including black rhinos and chimps, and some of us. Thank you very much for your kind attention. This is me in front of the piranha collection at the Georgia Aquarium in Atlanta. I did not feed them.
Well, that was a fascinating window into the insect and microbial kingdom there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
I
much,
spent my
Peter.
first 20 years in entomology almost exclusively.
Wow. Who might have some questions or comments? Thank you again, Peter.
Pleasure. Thank you for listening.
Feel free to raise your hand or just pipe in.
Well, thank you, Peter. I wanted to ask, are alkaloids always poisonous?
No.
Okay.
In fact, some of them are medicinal on their own,
Okay.
but they are largely produced by plants to be defensive materials.
Okay.
They are usually manufactured in a 5 or 7 step process from amino acids. The amino acid tyrosine, for instance, is used in the production of several notable toxic plant alkaloids. Most plants that specialize in alkaloid production as their chief folder, if you will, of secondary metabolites are toxic, however.
Okay, thanks.
Nicotine is a toxic alkaloid, for instance, and not a vitamin by most standards.
The topic of pollinators has been pretty prevalent over the last 3 years of these conversations.
Yes.
And certainly a lot of your presentation focused on that. There's also interest in chemicals, yard chemicals and things like that and their effect, how we can reduce the other toxins that we apply into control weeds or pests. I guess I don't have a specific question, but I'm wondering, it seems to me without much understanding of this insect world, if we're spraying random chemicals in our yards, we're probably having a negative impact. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. When I was first studying insects, their massive reproductive potential seemed at the time to insulate them from many of the factors that endangered other species in the environment. After all, if you have a chemical that can wipe out half of the reproductive potential of a particular insect, and that insect lays 2,000 eggs every month, clearly they are going to get past all but the most serious challenges to reproduction. However, now we know we have scores and scores of insects who are endangered in spite of their reproductive potential. And when you say using random chemicals, I'm not an advocate of using random chemicals, since nowadays that term can encompass quite a retinue of really toxic and or tragic materials.
You want to stop sharing your screen, Peter?
Oh, sure.
Um,
I'm bound to figure this out yet today.
What other questions do people have?
I have a not very well thought out question, Peter, but one plant that I didn't hear you mention, and I'm going to struggle for the name of it, but it has cow in it. It's like
Cow parsnip?
yeah, maybe that's it. Is it? But I've heard of it could be fairly toxic, but I don't know that it really is. Can you give a little light on that?
Cow parsnip, of course, in the genus Herculeum, in the carrot family. The carrot family is sort of headquarters for a group of toxins that we call furanocoumarins. Furanocoumarins, when they get on your skin, if they are present and your skin is moist and you go out in bright sunlight, you stand a chance of being seriously burned. The problem here is the furanocoumarins absorb ultraviolet from the sun and re-emit it as the precise frequency of ultraviolet that it takes to split an oxygen molecule, which is O2, in half. So you get two O1s. Now, O1s are known in the organic chemistry world as scavenging radicals, and they do potentially quite a bit of damage at the molecular level inside of a cell. For instance, they can kick out a couple of rungs of a DNA molecule, thereby preparing it to make a tumorous level of reproduction in the cell. And so when you have massive amounts of oxygen in your body being transformed into O1s, it can literally burn the membranes off your skin cells, causing the burn and the blistering effect of these toxins once exposed to sunlight. Many carrot family plants have these furanocoumarins. Probably the most famous is the garden parsnip. Now, when garden parsnips escape, oddly enough, they become wild parsnips. And wild parsnips are really dangerous in this way. If you injure the plant and get sap on yourself, or if you wear shorts and wade through a thicket of 5 or 6 foot tall wild parsnips, you stand an excellent chance on a sunny day of getting burned, just like you would with cow parsnip. The other plant that's fairly famous for this is called giant hogweed. Giant hogweed is Herculeum mantagasianum, one of the few double Z words I can think of for Scrabble use. Not that your companions would allow you to use Herculaneum, scientific name for a Scrabble word anyway, but the problem with the cow parsnip grew, Herculeum, is that instead of having to injure the plant is fuzzy and actually wears droplets of sap on the threads of its fuzzy surfaces. And so simply pushing your way through a thicket of cow parsnip or wild parsnip in shorts can leave you with significant disfiguring burns because of the action of the furanocoumarins in sunlight. Now, that was kind of an incomplete answer, but it gets to the meat of the problem, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that covered it pretty good for me.
Okay. Thank you.
So yeah, then it kind of reminds me too of stinging nettles, but
Yes.
stinging nettles doesn't have this, what sounds to be such a disastrous effect, does it? It's just stings you for a little kind of a temporary time.
Exactly. Most people, stinging nettles is only a bother for the first 15 minutes or so. But for people who are sensitive or allergic, it may cause a blistering that lasts for up to a week. Stinging nettles are covered with little tiny trichomes that have a sharp silica tip capable of penetrating skin. And when you get stung by these little needles, you get a little tiny injection of a histamine mixed with formic acid. The word formic comes from the Latin word forma, that means ants. It is the same stuff that you get in the sting of an ant. And you can deactivate nettle sting material by cutting off the turgor pressure of the plant. So anything that involves drying, boiling, or steaming will take away the stinging abilities of nettles. And that is why nettles are a popular food. New shoots of nettles are delicious and one of the most broad spectrum nutritious foods you can take into the body. What happens is when you brush against the plant, you get that little silica needle tip in your skin, and it usually breaks off, exposing your skin to the little injection of formic acid and histamine, which causes the red bump, the little irritated rashy thing that you get if you get stung. There's a place in England where they actually have an annual competition where the competition amounts to how much raw nettle can you eat. That must be sponsored by the masochism department. But I have never eaten nettles raw. They're very good. And if you boil them for 5 or so minutes, a lot of the nutritional value and plant contents enters the water, which, if you cook it long enough, becomes almost black and is extremely delicious as soup and nutritious. A woman of French heritage once showed me how to make a soup by putting a boiled potato in a blender with cooked nettles and their water, and turning on the blender to almost emulsify the potato, made this beautiful potato nettle soup that was exquisite. And because you can keep almost any mammal alive that you can get to eat nettles, I have no doubts that it's extremely nutritious. In fact, I've heard of people who bred horses feeding nettles to mares after they have their foal, because of it's like a postnatal vitamin pill. And they
So
do this
What
by
happens,
chopping.
what happens to all those little silica things in the cooking process? They just go away, or what
Well,
happens?
they're on top of a long needle-like structure that as soon as the turgor pressure of the plant is turned off, and they do this if they're going to feed it to horses, they usually cut it and then dry it in the sun. And that turns off the turgor pressure, and the little needle-like thing wilts and is no longer capable of sustaining a sting. I don't know of any nettles that are a serious problem unless you go to New Zealand. They have a thing in New Zealand called a tree nettle, Urtica ferox. And of course, ferox is the Latin word for ferocious. And there have actually been human fatalities from this. In fact, I believe I read that 5 of these minuscule little needles, of which the leaves and stems are upholstered, is a fatal dose for a guinea pig. That's a fairly strong toxin right there. I read of a human fatality about a guy who was riding a bike and crashed and fell into a thicket of these tree nettles that were very young, because they do get big enough to be real trees, but these were only about a foot tall. And he perished from his level of stings. But I don't know of any North American species that's remotely that dangerous. There is another one in Australia that is so painful, it has the common name is gimpy gimpy. And if you get stung, you're pretty gimpy for quite a while.
Well, this has been another fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. I
Thank
just
you
want
so
to,
much for your patience and watching.
as we wrap up, does anybody have any parting comments or questions? Hate to cut off this fountain of information. So hopefully we'll have you back again, Peter.
My pleasure to do that.
I just want to invite all of you, if you've got any topics or people that you'd like to invite to a future presentation, or if you have any thoughts about making this a podcast, please send them along. And
if you have any questions for me, send them on to Leroy. He will make sure that I get them, and we will take it from there. Thank you again.
sounds great. See some of you next week, and if not sooner.